Welcome to Pearls of the Interior Life. You know, you look like Jesus. You do. In fact, we're all called to look more and more like him the more we grow in this life. All right, fine. What exactly does that mean? That's what we're going to talk about today. Our big goal is happiness in this life and heaven in the next. To achieve this, we need to stay close to God throughout each day. But how do we do that while living in the real world with all of its challenges and distractions? Growing our interior life through Christian mental prayer is the answer. This podcast mines the riches of the greatest spiritual tradition on earth so we can grow in holiness together. I'm Steve Smith. Thank you for joining me for Pearls of the Interior Life. Thank you for tuning into this episode. Thank you for making this time for the Lord. Here we are, the first week of July, and in this weekly roundup in the news, there's been quite a bit of attention given to the fact that Jesus is depicted as white and European. And raises a very useful and illuminating question. Why do we depict Jesus that way? Why do people tend to see him as themselves? There's even that Christmas song, Some Children See Him, that talks about how children around the globe, they see Christ looking like them. And this gets us to the heart of iconography, creating religious images. An icon itself, it means to lead someone upward. And that's the point. In religious imagery and icons and iconography, what we're doing is revealing a deeper spiritual truth through a physical reality, a physical depiction. And we all get this. We get this, for instance, with emojis on our phone. You can't draw a picture of love itself. Love it's a concept. It's invisible. It's, first and foremost, it's an act of will. It's also, to a lesser degree, an emotion. But at any rate, you can't create an image of love, but instead we use hearts, we use kisses, and that sort of thing. In that sense, that emoji of a heart is an icon of love. It brings to mind that greater reality that, all of us then have our own conceptualization of what that means, how we experience love in our life. So that is where it comes in. Now, yes, some iconographers may have lower motives in whatever they created. And certainly many people looking at icons may not realize the reality of what they're looking at, but the truth, goodness, and beauty of icons is depicting that greater reality, that invisible reality that lies behind that physical image. And, one of those spiritual realities, one of the greatest among them, is that we are made in the image and likeness of God. But God is pure spirit. God doesn't have a body, at least not until he becomes Christ. And that is how we resemble God. We resemble God in our spirit, in our spiritual soul. We're told God breathes his spirit into us. And it's in our spiritual powers of intellect and our free will that we resemble God, which is marvelous. But what is the artist to do with that? What does our spiritual soul look like? How do you depict that in a piece of artwork? Well, you don't. Instead, you depict Christ as he became man, and you show him looking like us to remind us that we are meant to resemble him in our spirit. And every culture gets this. That's why we have Asian Jesuses and African Jesuses, South American Jesuses, certainly European. And here it is from Encyclopedia Britannica. A second distinguishing feature of Christological developments arising in the 20th century, and even long before that, was what might be called the cultural pluralism of Jesus images. The emergence of indigenous Christian churches in Africa and Asia brought about a rich variety of Jesus images and portrayals. Naturally, the same kind of cultural assimilation of Jesus iconography had taken place in Europe itself through the centuries, resulting in the traditional portrayal of Jesus as Northern European. Okay, fair enough. So that's iconography. It all becomes far more interesting when we stop focusing on the image and we get down to the spiritual reality that we were created to resemble God and specifically to resemble Christ. What does that mean? How does that play out in everyday life? Well, amongst other things, it means that our personality is a reflection of Christ. Now, the personality that we're talking about here is not the version of ourselves that we usually live with day in and day out and share with the world, because that version of ourself is marred by the fall and by our fallen nature. Our personality is the real self, who we were created to be. Unfortunately, that's covered, again, with the muck of our fallen nature. It's covered with our pride, our vanity, our insecurities, the personas we put on when we go out into the world. Billy Joel had his song, The Stranger. If you want to go back to the lyrics, he actually captures this concept very well. And a pop music sensibility. Our personality is, as we rid ourselves, what comes through. This is what St. Paul, as always, is talking about in ridding himself of the old man, that fallen self that comes through, again, from our fallen nature, from our woundedness, our self-inflicted wounds and the wounds that others inflict upon us, and so on. As we rid ourselves of that, of the old man, what shines through is then what St. Paul calls the new man. And this is also the same as what's often referred to as the false self and the true self. This is also the distinction between the ego and the true I, just a capital I, the personality of who I was created to be. And we all have a sense of this. There's times when it comes through, when we just react and we rise to the occasion in a moment of crisis, when we give without counting the cost, when we find ourselves perfectly at ease and just ourselves around somebody. This is the I, the real self, our true God-given personality coming through. And it's much of our mission here on earth to rid ourselves of that false self and grow into who we were created to be. Here, we'll turn to Fulton Sheen a few times during this talk. Here's one way that he puts this. The I, or the real self, bears the divine image. It is the personality which is rooted in God. A human personality is worth more than the material universe. Here, Fulton Sheen is bringing up a very important point, that true self is actually how we reflect Christ to the world. I remember I was in a training session once, and it involved going through a personality test, like the Myers-Briggs, not that, but similar. And the instructors were using historical examples of showing different personality types, Napoleon or George Washington or Gandhi, to illustrate choleric and melancholic and sanguine personalities and all that kind of thing. And I remember asking one of the instructors, what about Jesus? From what we see of him, what do you think his personality type was? And the instructor had a marvelous answer. They just said, he had it all. He had it all. And in fact, from a theological standpoint, Jesus doesn't have a personality per se. A personality is how is sort of a limitation. He had a nature that was perfect, that was the entire breadth of what a human being should be. So each one of us, when we are getting to the heart of who we truly are, again, is a reflection of Christ. We are a ray of his divine light. And light here is a good analogy, because again, if we picture taking light and putting it through a prism, and out comes the spectrum of the rainbow. Likewise, if we could take Christ's nature and put it through a prism, what would come out is all of humanity, each one of us as an individual facet of Christ that we bring into the world. Here again is how Fulton Sheen puts this. It often happens that we forget the humanity of Christ. The human nature of Christ represented the human nature of every single person who has ever lived. Now, the human nature of Christ, simply because it was not capped, was not limited or confined by a human personality, but embraced within itself all the human natures of the world, was almost as if we had a playground in which there were no fences or walls. Then all children could come into this playground. Read his genealogy in the Gospel of Matthew. You will find saints, but you will also find sinners. You'll find Gentile women like Ruth. You'll find public sinners like Rahab. These were typical of the humanity of Christ assumed into himself. But also every single human being who would ever be born until the end of time was incorporated into his humanity. Hence, there is not Buddhist, there is not Confucianist, there is not communist, there is not a sinner, there is not a saint that is not in some way in this human nature of Christ. You are in it. Your neighbor next door is in it. Every persecutor of the church is in it. They may not recognize their incorporation to Christ, but in a certain sense, every person in the world is implicitly a Christian in his human nature. So this is what we're seeing in the icon. Yes, Christ was born a Middle Eastern man. That doesn't mean I need to change my skin color, my hair color to resemble Christ. It means I have to change my mind. I have to change my heart to resemble Christ. And Fulton Sheen's words also bring up another marvelous point that's reflected then in the icon, that everyone resembles Christ. And the flip side of that is true, that we should see Christ in everyone around us. One more from Fulton Sheen. The path of true human perfection is the one through which a person so overshadows both his ego and his I as to see both his neighbor and his I through the eye of God. Now, this type of seeing, truly seeing who our neighbor is created to be and truly seeing who we're created to be, is not the type of seeing that we see with the eye that looks at the icon. That's the type of seeing that comes from the mind and the heart with which we see through the icon to the spiritual reality behind it of how much God loves us, that he made us each in his image and his likeness. Thank you again so much, as always, for tuning in. I wish you a wonderful weekend, wonderful 4th of July, and I look forward to being with you again.